1 week before hostilities, China has telegraphed its intention to invade Taiwan for months, assembling a force of 1.2 million to take on approximately 400,000 Taiwanese defenders can't be done in secret. Nor can the vast armada of transport ships be gathered together in ports across China's coast along the Taiwan Strait. Hundreds of military vessels are supplemented by thousands of smaller civilian Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels. Every available inch of deck space has been accounted for. The invasion to take Taiwan will be the largest amphibious operation in human history, absolutely dwarfing the Normandy landings. It'll also be the bloodiest campaign in history, with casualties estimated to reach 1 million from both sides combined, if not more. The Taiwan Strait separates Taiwan from China by 100 miles. During their travel across the strait, Chinese ships will be incredibly vulnerable to Taiwan's vast hordes of anti-ship missiles. In the last few years, Taiwan has kick-started its domestic anti-ship manufacturing capabilities, prompting China to accelerate its timetable for invasion. However, steady U.S. supplies of Harpoon and air defense missiles have created one of the densest concentration of anti-air and anti-ship defenses in the world. For months, China's been infiltrating Taiwan with special forces and intelligence agents. A campaign of sabotage has slowly been carried out across the strait on both sides, with Taiwanese operatives also sabotaging Chinese transportation infrastructure. Technically already in a state of war, neither side has yet to launch missiles against the other, but that's about to change very soon. In response to the Chinese buildup, the United States and its allies have been steadily moving men and equipment into the region. But the United States, the world's preeminent military power, is unable to bring the majority of its combat power to bear against China, a crippling vulnerability. That's because the U.S. has global defense commitments, and the sudden evacuation of American military hardware from around the world would leave security vacuums that could prompt major regional conflicts. The EU has sent a token force of ships and non-combat support equipment, not wishing to get heavily embroiled in a military conflict against China, given the threat that Russia now poses on its own border. However, they have supported the U.S. in a sanctions campaign against China, hoping to deter President Xi Jinping from invasion through the enactment of swift and severe sanctions at the first sign of his military buildup. It's not as easy to sanction China as Russia, however, given that China and the EU enjoy about $700 billion in trade in a year. Many Europeans question the decision to back the US politically. The South Pacific is not their problem, after all. But that's not true at all. If China takes Taiwan, it'll be in control of the world's largest producer of semiconductors, giving it a near total monopoly over these vital components produced in few other places. This will give President Xi Jinping and his authoritarian Chinese Communist Party unprecedented leverage over every modern nation. Australia, the Philippines, and Japan have gone all in on their support of the U.S. For all three, China is a major security threat. Not only is China engaged in a dispute over certain islands with Japan, but China taking Taiwan would in effect break the first island chain, which has for decades contained communist powers in Asia. China breaking containment would hurl the U.S. out of the West Pacific and give China control of the most important shipping lanes in the entire world. Australia especially would be even further isolated from its allies, leaving it at the mercy of China. South Korea finds itself in an incredibly precarious situation. Under its mutual defense treaty with the United States, it's technically an ally of America and treaty-bound to defend it. It has done so in every war since the Vietnam War, and both nations working together have successfully deterred North Korean aggression and kept South Korea free. However, a war with China will open up a conflict on two fronts for the small nation and could encourage North Korea to attack the South. It'll have to carefully weigh any decision to support or not support the United States in case of a war. Of course, if the US shoots first, then the terms of the treaty no longer apply, and both China and the US are heavily incentivized to shoot at each other first. Both nations' counterforce capabilities are so significant that the war will heavily favor the one who shoots first, possibly even deciding the fate of the entire conflict. Both the US and China are just as incentivized to not shoot first, as whoever does so will likely lose all international support and be seen as the antagonist. The US risks losing the support of Asian nations if it shoots first, and the support of the rest of the world in a campaign of sanctions against China. But for China, the decision is a little easier than for the US. It knows it'll already be seen as the aggressor the moment it crosses the strait, and it also knows that if it doesn't shoot first, it risks having the entire invasion effort irrevocably sabotaged. China assumes it'll lose most Western support in the invasion alone, and it only really risks losing the support of the global South if it shoots first against American targets. Day 1. Always bet on China shooting first. The war begins with the greatest missile attack in history. Thousands of missiles lift into the skies off mainland China and from ships and submarines off the coast. Many of these are targeting Taiwan, destroying known command and control nodes, communication networks, defense installations, and troop concentrations. A rain of high explosives comes down over the island, and the damage is catastrophic, with thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. Hundreds of these missiles, though, come down on American targets throughout the region. DF-26 and DF-21s, dubbed carrier killers by China, scream down from space onto U.S. ships. American Aegis vessels greet them all with a hail of SM-3s and SM-6s. The ship's ANSPY-1 radars track the incoming ballistic missiles as the Aegis network calculates a firing solution. As the missiles discard their initial boosters, they establish communications with their home ships and link up with the U.S. GPS system to receive course corrections to their targets. The kinetic warhead packs no explosives, instead slamming into the incoming missile at a combined close rate of thousands of miles an hour, delivering 130 megajoules of energy to the missile and annihilating it. U.S. ballistic missile defense is good, but not perfect. Most of the incoming Chinese missiles are intercepted, but not all. However, U.S. ships receive plenty of warning of the incoming attack thanks to satellite missile warning systems and have been steaming at full power to make themselves more difficult to strike. Despite this, dozens of U.S. ships across the Pacific are seriously damaged. One aircraft carrier is sunk, with the loss of its full air wing. Just 30 minutes into the war, and China has caused billions of dollars in damage to the U.S. Navy. The second wave of missile attacks targets U.S. and allied airfields across the South Pacific. China's decided to go all in, knowing it can't allow the U.S. to have any breathing room in the Pacific. It targets airfields from Japan to South Korea to the Philippines and even some in the very north of Australia. The attack guarantees that all of the U.S.'s partners will enter the war in the Pacific, but it's seen as a necessary cost to pay given how vulnerable China would be without knocking U.S. air power out of the theater. Shore-based air defenses and missile cruisers throughout the South Pacific attempt to knock the rain of ballistic missiles out of the sky, with mixed success. The biggest problem that the Pacific allies have is the sheer number of missiles being fired at them versus the total number of air defense assets available. Inevitably, China overwhelms Pacific defenses, scoring crippling hits on military facilities across the Pacific. Runways are easier to repair, but airplanes are not. The U.S. has criminally underinvested in hardened aircraft shelters, and despite having widely dispersed its aircraft in anticipation of a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack, still suffers over half of its regional combat power damaged or destroyed. Fuel depots and maintenance facilities are destroyed by the missile attack, and even more surface combat vessels fall under the onslaught of hundreds of missiles being fired by the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force. The barrages deplete stocks of Allied ballistic missile interceptors and overwhelm the defenses of Japanese and American ships. Guam has been devastated by the ballistic missile attack, which has targeted the island with great prejudice. As the gateway to the Pacific for the U.S., it's America's most important base in the region, and now it's mostly ruins. It's not just the airfields and aircraft hangars that have been destroyed, though. It's also the special military docks needed to resupply and maintain the U.S. Pacific Fleet. On the heels of waves of missile attacks, waves of Chinese H-6 bombers fly toward Okinawa. Surviving Japanese and American aircraft scramble to defend the vital air bases on the islands, but cratered runways make the task even more difficult. Armed with long-range standoff weapons, the H-6s fire volleys of large air-to-ground missiles against the island. The Allied interceptors are redirected from trying to take down the bombers to engaging the large missiles with their own air-to-air missiles. It's a dicey proposition, but some hits are scored. However, over 100 missiles continue making their way toward the base. Patriot air defense batteries fill the sky with interceptors, knocking even more out of the sky. Several dozen, however, penetrate the battered U.S. and Japanese defenses to devastate military targets. It's been 2 hours since the war started, and the U.S. has suffered the greatest military defeat in history. Tens of billions of dollars of hardware has been destroyed. Much more has been seriously damaged. At least half of the U.S. Pacific Fleet is sunk or rendered combat ineffective. The U.S. has bet big on its ability to beat the rain of ballistic missiles that the PLARF can deliver, and in the real world may be more or less effective than in our scenario. But one thing is for sure, it will not escape the steel rain scot-free. Now, though, the U.S. retaliates. U.S. ships have been unable to operate close to Chinese shores due to the missile threat, but U.S. submarines face no such limitations. China has notoriously poor anti-submarine warfare capabilities, and now America's silent service gets to its grim work with disturbing efficiency. The subs are unable to operate within the Taiwan Strait itself due to the shallow depth making them vulnerable to detection. But in the East and South China Sea, there's no such concern. American attack subs pounce on the People's Liberation Army Navy, sinking dozens of surface combatants in short order. China's own submarines are increasing in sophistication, but still notoriously noisy and also fall prey to America's boats. Some of America's submarines are armed with the new Maritime Strike Tomahawk, which has a range of 1,000 miles and features the ability to self-designate targets without the aid of external platforms. While the U.S. plans for the bulk of the submarine fleet to eventually carry this weapon, it's only entered service in 2023 and thus is available in limited numbers. Those that are available, however, are launched against Chinese ships in the Taiwan Strait itself, which are even now streaming across the strait to start the invasion of Taiwan. The Maritime Strike Tomahawks join the reign of anti-ship missiles such as harpoons coming down the Chinese sailors' heads from Taiwan. Chinese air defenses struggle to defend the invasion fleet, but like U.S. forces across the Pacific, quickly become oversaturated. Hundreds of ships are struck, many are sunk, become dead in the water, or are forced to turn around. Overhead, Chinese attack aircraft are screaming toward Taiwan to suppress the island's missile defenses, but must contend with surviving elements of the Taiwanese air defense network. Incredibly lethal Patriot batteries engage Chinese aircraft, while the surviving Taiwanese Air Force lobs AIM-120s at the incoming attack waves. Inevitably, though, Taiwan's air defenses are overwhelmed. With 1,200 combat aircraft versus Taiwan's 300, it's a numbers game, and the numbers heavily favor China's side. Day 2. Fierce deliberation rages inside the Hall of Power in Beijing. Before hostilities began, the United States had pulled back a significant amount of its air and naval power to the safety of Hawaii. Chinese military planners want to strike at Hawaii with ballistic missiles and long-range bombers, while U.S. carrier operations are still disrupted. However, the Chinese Politburo fears that attacking Hawaii directly will only galvanize the American people, whom they're hoping to be so demoralized by taking the largest casualties the nation has faced since Vietnam that political support for the war will evaporate. Inevitably, the decision to attack Hawaii is made. Chinese bombers follow on the heels of a ballistic missile attack against Hawaii by the PLARF's longer-range missiles. Hickam Air Force Base command headquarters is destroyed, a serious setback for U.S. Pacific operations. The incoming bomber attack is spotted by AWACS surveillance platforms, but F-18s struggle to rise to meet the threat due to intense damage to the airfields. Only a few of the bombers are downed before they release their long-range standoff attack cruise missiles, which bring further devastation to the U.S. Air Force and naval installations on the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaii isn't as badly damaged as Guam, but America's ability to fight in the Pacific has been seriously degraded. As feared by the Politburo, though, the American public is enraged by what is now being called a second Pearl Harbor. Public support to prosecute this war until its conclusion, no matter how painful, skyrockets. Off the coast of China, U.S. submarines launch cruise missiles against oil pipelines and storage facilities along China's northern border with Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. The attacks destroy one of China's few land-bound oil import routes. Only its pipeline along the western border is intact. This is a critical concern to China, as the U.S. Navy has already sprung into action in the Gulf of Oman to shut down Chinese shipping of badly needed oil supplies. With 60% of its national oil consumption coming in through sea lanes, the Chinese economy will have to switch to severe austerity measures to support the war effort. American Marines stormed the Chinese naval facility in Djibouti, backed up by a shore bombardment from U.S. naval vessels and allied aircraft. The fight is completely one-sided. China knew it would never be able to hold the small base, and the move is largely symbolic. Djibouti launches a diplomatic protest against the United States, which goes largely ignored. Runways have been quickly repaired across the Pacific, and U.S. and Japanese fighters begin to engage Chinese air forces over Taiwan. However, the tyranny of distance works against the Allies, as they're forced to cross hundreds of miles of open sea to arrive at their battle space. This leaves them reliant on airborne refueling, though luckily the U.S. maintains the largest airborne refueling fleet in the world. Sortie rates are still very low, and without carrier support and the transfer of hundreds of combat aircraft from other theaters, the fight over Taiwan is at a stalemate. U.S. F-35s and F-22s are a deadly threat to Chinese air forces, but the Chinese PL-15 is a superior air-to-air missile over the AIM-120, outranging it by an estimated 10 to 15 miles. This means that against a fourth-generation plane, China has the advantage, and China's J-20s may not be a true fifth-generation stealthy aircraft, but their low observability combined with the PL-15's range makes them a deadly threat to Allied fourth-generation aircraft. AWACS platforms are especially vulnerable to J-20s, and the Allies struggle to keep their critical AWACS in the sky as numerous planes are shot down by the Chinese. On the beaches, China is landing troops successfully but at horrific cost. The Taiwanese have created miles upon miles of booby traps and shore defenses just in case of such an invasion, including underwater pipes that release oil, which is then lit as Chinese landing craft approach their shores. Thousands of Chinese soldiers are killed before reaching the beach. Those who survive are greeted by stretches of beach littered with booby traps and mines, with heavily fortified defensive positions maintained by Taiwanese defenders. Shore bombardment helps soften these defenses up, but any aircraft attempting to provide close air support is immediately threatened by man-portable air defense systems. Week 2. Chinese special forces have launched raids against U.S. Air Force bases across the continental U.S. These hit-and-run attacks use suicide drones to seriously damage high-value American aircraft, such as tankers, AWACS, and B-52 bombers. The damage is enough to make these planes non-mission capable and require weeks of repair. U.S. Air Force security forces are completely ineffective in repelling the surprise attacks due to a lack of training and basic incompetence. In Taiwan itself, Chinese special forces have also attempted assassination strikes against Taiwan's leadership in a campaign that started on the first day of the war. However, Taiwanese special forces, assisted by American Delta Force operatives deployed to the island ahead of the conflict, successfully have prevented attempts on the president's life. A few senior politicians have been killed by Chinese special forces or precision strikes, but the Taiwanese government remains relatively intact and safe on the eastern side of the island. West Taiwan, meanwhile, is a battlefield. The Chinese have successfully established a beachhead, albeit at a terrible price. Missile attacks against their transport fleet continue daily, and every major amphibious transport in the Chinese Navy is either sunk or damaged. The effort largely continues with civilian assets pressed into service as the Chinese Air Force continues to attempt to wrest control of the skies from the Pacific allies. Taiwan airspace remains contested as Japan and the U.S. struggle to keep up flight operations while forced to fly from the Japanese islands or in the Philippines. The People's Liberation Army rocket forces, however, have expended most of their missile inventory, allowing the U.S. Navy to press closer to Taiwan. American Marines based out of Okinawa prepare to deploy to Taiwan, landing on the friendly eastern side to support Taiwanese defenders. On the west side of the island, China is embroiled in brutal urban combat inside some of the most densely populated cities in the world. The Taiwanese people largely have nowhere to go, as the PLAN has refused to grant access to civilian evacuation vessels. International pressure continues to mount on China to allow for the evacuation of civilians, but it refuses to bow, instead offering civilians exit from the island to the mainland. Few Taiwanese citizens accept the offer, and tragically, anti-ship strikes by the Allies inevitably destroy a large ferry carrying Taiwanese civilians. Chinese propagandists immediately flood global media with tales of the tragedy, gaining traction in some parts of Europe, South America, and Africa. The skies over Taiwan remain contested, with the loss of hundreds of combat planes on both sides. Chinese aviators enjoy a high chance of rescue, while American and Japanese aviators only rely on rescue from Taiwan Coast Guard vessels. Half of them perish at sea. The loss of combat-trained pilots impacts the U.S. a lot more, as it's already facing a shortage of combat pilots. However, it entered the conflict with more aircraft than China, which helps offset the impact of the losses. Week 3. In the Malacca Straits, U.S., Filipino, and Australian vessels have enacted a complete blockade of Chinese shipping. China protests at the UN that the blockade should have been lifted, claiming that the stop of its seaborne trade will jeopardize the lives of millions of its citizens. The loss of imported oil is a pending national crisis for China. A war for public opinion is being waged around the world, with the U.S. enjoying favor in Europe and South Asia, and China being favored in Africa and South America. The U.S. has engaged in a missile campaign against mainland China, as China's anti-access area denial assets are slowly depleted, allowing combat aircraft and the U.S. Navy to approach closer. American stealth bombers strike at Chinese ports and supply depots on the coast. The Chinese Navy is faltering as it faces attack by advanced U.S. anti-ship weapons. LRASMs delivered via F-18s, F-35s, and B-1 Lancers feature stealth characteristics and artificial intelligence to invade Chinese fleet defenses until the last possible moment. China's success rate in shooting these missiles out of the sky hovers at just over 30%, and packing over twice the explosives of a harpoon, this new generation of weapons proves lethal. However, it's America's Rapid Dragon program that is China's greatest threat. Consisting of entire pallets of LRASMs and other standoff missiles, Rapid Dragon utilized normal transport aircraft to deliver dozens of missiles at a time. A 3-ship formation of C-17s can now bring over 120 LRASMs to bear against Chinese ships, an absolutely incredible level of firepower. China's dwindling supply of J-20 stealth fighters, the only platform capable of getting near enough to escort its C-17s to threaten them, means it's slowly but surely losing the naval and air war. Both sides have lost incredible amounts of firepower, and the US fourth-generation aircraft fleet has been decimated. It's also lost large numbers of F-35s, but the planes are having an outsized effect on the conflict. However, they're limited by their very low sortie rate and the limited 6 long-range missiles that each plane can pack. With surviving US carriers now finally able to operate closer to the Taiwan conflict area, the Navy's F-35s are starting to make a significant impact on the air war. Week 4. Combat aircraft continue to surge into the conflict from both sides, but the numbers are starting to favor the Allies. The inclusion of the Japanese and Australian air forces as well as American combat aircraft from other theaters means the Allies are able to replenish their losses faster. They still suffer from the tyranny of distance though, with Allied aircraft having to fly hundreds of miles to and back from a conflict. Losses among the U.S. aerial tanker fleet are mitigated by the sheer number of tankers the U.S. operates, but the intensity of the air war means large numbers of tankers are needed for each attack wave. This is putting a severe strain on America's tankers. Off the coast of Los Angeles, a Chinese nuclear submarine launches cruise missiles against the power plants in the vast city. The damage is moderate, but knocks out power for several days to large swaths of LA County. The attack is largely symbolic, but does result in hundreds of deaths from vulnerable citizens, mostly the elderly. Rather than deter the U.S. population, though, it only emboldens them to further support the war. Chinese influence agents working across college campuses and organizations across the U.S. fail to significantly impact public opinion. America, however, has suffered over 5,000 dead in 1 month of fighting and lost over $10 billion in combat hardware. Even if the war were to stop today, it would take years for America's military to rebuild. Week 5. Chinese forces take nominal control of Taipei. They'll find themselves beset by a wave of partisan fighting. Pre-war polls showed the vast majority of the Taiwan population rejected the idea of reunification with China, and thousands of citizens regularly engaged in basic close-quarters combat and first aid courses taught by military veterans across the island. The air war over Taiwan has shifted in favor of the Allies as China's inventory of modern aircraft begins to dwindle and it's forced to dip into older and older stocks. The conflict has consumed incredible amounts of munitions on both sides though, and the US is struggling to resupply its forces with cruise missiles and other precision weapons. The bombing campaign against mainland China has spurred fierce debate in Washington, not just because of the loss of aircraft, but because as Chinese forces are becoming frustrated on Taiwan and global sanctions and a blockade crash the Chinese economy, many fear that China will turn to the use of nuclear weapons. One thing is clear, for the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan is a matter of national survival. If the party fails to secure Taiwan, it will lose all credibility. A population angered by the effects of the blockade and sanctions will take its anger out on party officials. Already, Western influence agents are sowing the seeds of a potential democratic revolution amongst the Chinese youth. But it has no hope of succeeding without the defeat of China's armed forces. Week 6. America's naval blockade of Chinese trade has caused global markets to tumble and had an outside impact in Africa. Anger against America stirs as millions are impacted by the U.S.'s attempt to strangle China financially and choke it into submission. People living in Africa, already impacted by the war in Ukraine, once more see this as a Western problem, not theirs. Chinese influence agents stir up anti-Western sentiment across much of the developing world. The West has ignored the global South for too long, giving Chinese influence an outsized effect. The United States attempts to create internal security threats inside mainland China by providing weapons to Muslim extremists in China's east. However, to move weapons to extremist groups, America seeks the help of the Taliban and their connections with tribal forces in Pakistan's lawless tribal regions. Negotiations turn sour very quickly, and the Taliban refuses. In retaliation, the U.S. launches several airstrikes against Taliban military targets, claiming Taliban forces were presenting an immediate threat to civilians. The story fails to gain traction in global media as it's buried by an avalanche of news coming from the South Pacific. Week 10. American Marines have joined the fight on Taiwan, arriving via safe eastern ports. Their deployment is made possible by the fact that Allied air power has finally forced China to remain mostly on its side of the strait, though it's still able to target Taiwan via standoff weapons. The deployment of ground forces is controversial inside the United States, especially given the significant losses already suffered by the U.S. Navy and Air Force. America has already suffered over 15,000 dead and wounded in fierce Pacific fighting and from a fresh wave of long-range ballistic missile strikes. The fight to throw the People's Liberation Army off the island promises to bring thousands more casualties. In Japan, the choice to deploy its own ground forces is met with fierce resistance from large segments of the government and population both. Japan has been undergoing a period of transformation from a purely self-defense force to redefining its concept of self-defense to include even preemptive expeditionary offensives in the interest of self-defense. However, the population has been slow to catch up to this shift in official policy, and the deployment of Japanese soldiers to Taiwan has become a lightning rod for anti-government protests. Chinese forces control most of the western side of Taiwan, though they are bogged down by several pockets of fierce resistance inside the cities. Much like Ukrainian defenders in Mariupol, the Taiwanese defenders face a hopeless situation, but are forcing China to dedicate large amounts of resources to containing them. China has studied the war in Ukraine carefully, and it knows it must win this invasion quickly before significant U.S. firepower arrives on the island and international opinion turns even more against it. However, its options are running out. Its navy is being challenged both in and outside of the strait itself, making it difficult to resupply its invasion forces. American submarines are having an outsized effect on the conflict, striking quickly and slipping away into the depths. Because China lacks the ships to transport enough troops, only a partial national mobilization has been enacted. As the casualties pile up, the effects of sanctions and a U.S. blockade of its Pacific trade hit home. China must be close to considering some significantly difficult choices, and one of those choices is the preemptive use of nuclear weapons. This sparks major controversy inside Beijing, as China has an official no first-use policy. Ultimately, though, it is settled. China will not use a nuclear weapon in combat. Instead, it will conduct an atmospheric explosion hundreds of miles off the Taiwanese coast. It's meant to be a show of strength and a fait accompli to the United States. Many, however, do not believe it'll work, given the U.S. was not deterred by Russia's nuclear threats in Ukraine. Others fear that the test will signal a step toward the breaking of China's no-first-strike policy, a move that will not just lead to nuclear exchanges between the U.S. and China, but even if it remains only limited in scope, destroy China's credibility on the international stage. The invasion is not failing, but it's also not succeeding. Given enough time, China might or might not gain the advantage on the ground in Taiwan, even as the U.S. gains the advantage in the air and the sea. A third conclusion, however, is forcing President Xi Jinping's hand. The American naval blockade in the Malacca Straits and the Gulf of Oman cannot be broken, and the austerity measures imposed on the Chinese society threaten to unravel it completely even as its economy tanks. The nuclear option looms heavily in Xi Jinping's mind. Now, go check out Putin's major problem for Russian military, or check out India versus China, who would win? Army-military comparison.